So, China and India are currently engaged in a low-level conflict in the Himalayas that has killed at least 21 Indian soldiers and probably many more on the Chinese side. That's worth talking about another time, but today I thought it'd be interesting to compare China and India's political system, because what's happening currently is both a military and a partly ideological battle between the largest two nations in the world. And the future of much of the world will depend on which of the two systems ultimately triumph. And it's very much a struggle within the developing world between a closed authoritarian system and a much more open liberal one. I first want to say that I actually know both countries fairly well. I lived in China for 2 years, travelled the country extensively and worked there. And I travelled India for over a month with Indian friends. I visited around 11 cities, and I have very fond memories of both countries. And I have many great friends from both India and China. But my own personal feelings aside, I think it's very revealing to look at the structural differences between the two countries. One thing to point out is that, in spite of the differences, India and China are actually a lot more similar than they'd like to admit. They're both obviously large, industrialising nations, and they're very influenced by their own nationalist movements, spurred on by a legacy of colonialism, mostly from Britain. But the biggest difference in terms of the culture of the people that you'll find if you visit is probably how seriously people take their local religions. In India, people take their temples and religious worship very seriously. You have to pay proper respects to the temples, you have to follow certain customs, some of them are off limits to foreigners, and they're usually packed with crowds of people who go to them. Whereas in China it's very common to see temples abandoned, and old temples are often demolished with new ones built, and you have to go to the rural areas to find large numbers of people who actually use the temples. Most young people in China know very little about their traditional religion, and this is purely because of China's history of communism, where they destroyed most of their local traditions and religions. Another big difference is the way it feels to walk the streets of each country, because the truth is that India has an incredible amount of poverty, and it's actually quite shocking if you've only ever lived in or visited developed countries. Obviously, standards of living have improved a lot in India and are still improving, but in China it's very rare that you see extreme poverty, at least in the big cities. China lies about its statistics. Independent surveys find that real levels of poverty are somewhere between 10 and 20%. And to combat this, the government often forces people into accommodation and into forced labour. So forcing people into slavery is one way to eliminate poverty. But poverty is very much swept under the rug in China, so it's not very visible. Whereas in India it is very visible, you encounter it everywhere you go. You can find developed cities in India that are similar to the top tier cities in China, like Bangalore. But although China does fake statistics, it's still true that poverty levels in India are far higher than they are in China. India also feels a lot more corrupt than China. If you go there, you actually see cops taking bribes in India. I actually had a personal police escort take me around the Taj Mahal, just because my friend's dad had connections with the police. Which is something that you don't see very much in China. You don't really see police openly taking bribes. But China is incredibly corrupt in a different way, in that every business relies on giving and taking bribes to government institutions. And so we actually had the police raid our training centre multiple times when I worked in China, because they simply wanted to get more money from us as fines in the form of bribes. And because of these practices, China a few years ago was ranked worse than India on the corruption index, where they ask people how many bribes they give in a year, which is a pretty epic achievement from Xi Jinping, considering he spent the last 8 years doing an anti-corruption campaign. So what explains this difference in income levels and levels of development between India and China? It's partially a reflection of policy differences and partially a historical and geographic legacy. If you look at China's history, it's mostly a history of being a unified empire that's broken up through periods of disunity, whereas India's history is one of being a group of separate, disunified kingdoms that are occasionally unified. So people forget that before the British Raj, there wasn't really a unified state called India, it was a collection of separate kingdoms. And this is reflected very much in the political structure of both countries today. India has vastly different ethnicities. It has the Indo-Aryan population in the north and the very different looking Tamils in the south. It has vastly different cultural traditions within the country, which you'll see if you travel it. And the country isn't really unified by language. Only around 30 to 40% of Indians actually speak Hindi, the sort of official language, and even less speak English. The rest speak their own local dialects, and so it's very difficult to have an integrated economy when the country doesn't have a unified language. In China, by contrast, there's a lot more unification and standardization with language and writing systems, and basically because the people are very ethnically similar compared to India. And so that's why China often engages in its Sinicization policies to try and integrate people to become Chinese. And this is reflected in the governmental structure, as China has one of the highest percentage of state employees in the world by all accounts. By some estimates, it has up to 40% of people work for the government, whereas India has one of the lowest. State workers in India by percentage is close to 4%. And these are totally opposite ends of the spectrum. Some scholars like Francis Fukuyama will say that this is because India historically was ruled by a religious class of priests called the Brahma, who made the religious laws, and so the government actually didn't interfere in people's daily lives that much, whereas China had a system totally dominated by a political entity, and the religious scholars had very little influence. And so because of that, Indians don't have the same administrative traditions as China does. And in some ways it's sad because China traditionally had this view of India as this place of great spiritualism, where Buddhism came from. And so monks would make these great journeys to find out about the spiritual teachings found in India, and that's where the novel Journey to the West with the Monkey King comes from. And so it's a shame that the relationship has come what it has because of China's leadership. But the other important explanation of income differences has to do with the recent history of the two countries. Because, strangely, India has one of the most developed IT and technology industries in the world. It has its own space program, and yet it's not capable of providing basic plumbing to large sections of its population. Whereas China, when it comes to infrastructure, it has a lot of problems, but in general it's comparatively good at providing services like plumbing, electricity, and public transport. And these are things I think you have to acknowledge even if you're a critic of the regime like I am. And a lot of these economic differences between the countries has to do with the policies in the second half of the 20th century. Because although China was communist, and that was obviously pretty terrible for the economy, but in the 1970s they opened up, they adopted a more free market policy, and they allowed investment. And in the 2000s, China was specifically chosen by the United States to be the world's factory. It was the largest population under the same political system, and so Western countries decided to move a lot of factories there. And it was hoped that this would lead to China eventually democratizing like Taiwan and Korea did in the 1990s. Bill Clinton actually said this in a speech after visiting China in the 90s, which by the way was probably the most wrong prediction of the last 50 years.
That this agreement exchanges membership rights for China in the WTO for economic opportunities for America in China. You've heard Chairman Greenspan address the human and political rights aspects and make the point that increasing access to a market economy increases personal freedom in other ways. That's why people who have been themselves oppressed in China have pleaded with us to support this, because they know getting into a rules-based system and promoting economic competition will both enhance the march of liberty and law and human rights.
And so a large amount of China's growth was driven by foreign investment, and the claim that this is all due to the genius policies of the CCP is purely their propaganda. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that while India was officially non-aligned during the Cold War, it actually proclaims itself to be a socialist country, and it makes references to socialism in its constitution. Now, it's not a communist country, there is a difference, but this means that for a very long time, India had very high protectionist tariffs against foreign goods, and it didn't allow competition with other countries, and it had a lot of government-directed investment, which frankly made the economy very uncompetitive. It was only in 1991, when India went through a financial crisis, and then decided to liberalise its economy, at request of the OECD, that it then opened up its economy and saw the tripling of its economy since then in the aftermath. And so, ironically, despite China being officially communist, it actually managed to develop their economy because of a free market approach, helped by Western investment, whereas India lagged behind by doing the opposite. Whereas now, because foreign investment is moving to cheaper countries, China is having to shift away from this model, and that's why the economy is stalled, and that's partly what's driving this aggressive approach from Xi Jinping and the current leadership. That's why he engages in his policies like Belt and Road, massive industrial nationalisation, and that's why the economy is stagnating, which it has apparently been doing since 2018. And so before the coronavirus, India was the world's fastest growing economy, and it's predicted to overtake China in a few decades. And so currently what the Indian government under Modi is basically trying to do is to centralise Indian society under a more streamlined economic policy and build infrastructure, and also kind of use this sort of more Hindu nationalist identity to achieve some of this. But the difference is that because India is democratic, it's much more open and it allows dissent and protests. It doesn't disappear political dissidents, it doesn't intern mass groups of people. Although it has corrupt cases from local officials, it doesn't do this as a part of government policy. Because it's a more open system, it's more vulnerable to totalitarian systems, which can infiltrate and try and subvert it. And so I think because of this, it's actually a weakness in the short run on the part of India, but it's actually a strength in the long run, because it has more potential to develop and build on what it has, whereas China, under its current leadership, can never reform. But at the end of the day, China could be the richest and most prosperous, innovative country in the world, and I would still not want to live permanently under its system. Because it's totalitarian, it doesn't have the freedom and openness that democratic countries do, and it doesn't tolerate dissent or criticism. And that's why India still has a better system. So I think Western countries should openly support India in the conflict with China. I think this talk of moderation is, to be honest, not productive. It's simply a question of, do you support a democratic system or a dictatorship? And it should be an easy choice. And moving manufacturing and helping India's economy should be a priority of a developed democratic world, like it was once with China. And so that's my feeling on the subject. If you agree or disagree, I'd like to know your opinion in the comments, and I hope it was interesting or informative. So, thank you for listening.